Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, as always, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Paddy, how are you this week?
As per usual, Gary, I am absolutely fantastic. Although it's a Sunday morning, and it's not like we haven't recorded the podcast on a Sunday morning previously. However, I'm actually just really tired. I don't know why. Got full, my 8 or 7.5 hours of sleep last night. But if you start seeing me nod off, if you're watching this on the YouTube and you start seeing me nod off while Gary's talking, that's why. Um, but anyway, how are you, Gary? You've been still on placement. Is it still called placement, or is it just called slave labor, or what do they call it these days?
Placement. I actually wish it was slave labor, to be honest, because I thrive on
Slavery.
being busy and having a bit of responsibility rather than just being a sore thumb in the way of the medical team. So yeah, no, it's still on placement, on pediatrics placement. I have neonatology this week, which means small babies, which I'm very, very excited about. So I'm looking forward to that. And other than that, Storm Eunice has hit Ireland and the UK. I gather that the UK has had a worse experience than we had, which is quite typical. We tend to have the most bland weather ever. I'd love a bit of an extreme, but nothing too major here. We did have a bit of snow. That was exciting. The rear wheels were kicking out, going around roundabouts. That was fun. But other than that, I don't think there's anything too exciting. I'm tired myself now, although I kind of feel I'm in that stage where I'm almost manic tired, where I'm a bit tired, but not sleepy. Just like, yeah, let's go. I'm ready for the day. Because I only slept for, I think, 5.5 hours last night. And I think if I sleep less than 6, I get that little bit of mania. If I sleep between 6 and 7, I'm tired. And then more than 7, I'm good. So sleep less is the answer.
Chronically deprive yourself of sleep just for that little touch of mania.
Evidence-based treatment for depression, sleep deprivation. So
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, with the wind, because obviously I live in London, so it was literally just windy here. Like, in fairness, it was pretty windy at certain stages. Like, I obviously live, well, it's not obvious, but I live in a high rise, and
I obviously live in a penthouse.
Obviously, bro. But like, you could see all the like rubbish and everything, leaves, plastic bags, and everything just being thrown up into the air, which is kind of cool to see. But it just wasn't that bad here. I know the roof of the O2 got ripped up.
Yeah.
But it just wasn't that bad,
Mm-hmm.
I honestly thought Ireland got hit worse because your power went out.
Yeah, but our infrastructure is just terrible. So it's not surprising.
Very true. Like, it's basically, we left whatever the British left, and then, we've been hoping that doesn't break down since. And that's not actually very true, because Ireland did actually have the best electrical system in Europe at a time, because we were one of the last people to get it. So there is that. And then also we did have, some better infrastructure for other things, telephones, internet, etc. So no hate. Just saying that some things Ireland just does very poorly, such as keeping electricity going to Gary's house when we want to record a podcast. But
yeah, no, what was even worse, to be honest, is that they gave us a bit of electricity back where I'm living, but so little that boiling the kettle took like 45 minutes. Like, so it was just, and it would also just come on and off. So I'd turn on my computer, I'd be like, oh, it's great, it's back. And then it would just go zoom and turn off. But anyway, that's our problems discussed for this week. Thank you very much for listening to our venting session. We'll now move on to episode 2.
Just before we go on, do you remember a couple of years ago? I don't know, I can't remember what year it was. I wish I could, but remember, it just absolutely bucketed snow down in Ireland, and they just didn't have enough sand or salt even for the road.
2015, I think. I was
going to say 2015, but I couldn't be.
Yeah, something like that.
But they just didn't have enough sand whatsoever. It just didn't do anything about
or bread.
Like, so fucked up. But anyway, look, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about encouraging health in older individuals. And I say older individuals, and myself and Gary were talking about this literally just before the podcast, because older individuals is such a vague term. Like, I'm 30 years old. I'm, an older individual to some people. So we don't have a definition for what older individuals are. And we're basically just talking about people that are at a later stage of their life, could be in their late 20s, could be in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, but basically people that have maybe previously exercised but have fallen out of the habit of it, maybe previously been in good nutrition habits but have fallen out with it, have previously done nothing and they just want to start exercising, getting their nutrition in order. And effectively what we're trying to talk about is you now have an individual in front of you that doesn't know where to start, or potentially you are an individual that doesn't know where to start with this stuff. So how do you start actually, making change in your life? How do you start actually getting healthier? Like what's the process? What are we looking for? Do you have anything to add to that introduction there, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, obviously when we say older individuals, we're generally for most people, it's going to be, maybe in their late 50s, 60s, etc. But for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to bring, I think a simpler definition is if you are less active, less energetic, and you have less get up and go in you than you used to have, then I think that's fair enough to put you into the category of person that we're trying to help in this podcast. Some of you might be thinking, geez, I'm only 19 and I already feel like I'm in that position. Where's my youthful energy gone? But, if, for example, if you were, training GAA or football or soccer or whatever up into your early 20s, then maybe you kept up the strength conditioning for a while, then work got super busy in your early 30s and now you're late 30s and you're in a position thinking, God, I'm a shell of a man compared to what I used to be, or I haven't been to the gym in 5 years. I haven't exercised. My joints are a bit creaky. You're still dealing with some of the problems that we would consider worth managing now and preventing for the future that someone in their 60s might deal with. So, there's lots of transferable lessons in this podcast that are transferable between age groups.
Yeah. So effectively in this podcast episode, we want to create a return / start activity roadmap or health habits roadmap, whatever the fuck you want to call it. Either way, we're trying to that doesn't even make sense. We are going to try to create something here that would actually help you if you're younger, middle-aged, older, whatever. We want to give you that kind of roadmap, right? But the first thing I want to say is habit change is incredibly hard. So we are going to talk about like, oh yeah, this is what you have to do. This is what you have to do. And when we're trying to communicate that stuff with our clients, it's a lot easier to, first of all, identify exactly what we need to change, what habit we need to work on, all that kind of stuff. But also it allows us to, like that one-to-one, speaking to someone, talking to them, communicating with them, it allows us to actually solve the issues that make habit change hard, right? And even still, it's still hard, right? So if you're you're looking at this podcast or you're listening to this podcast and you're going, oh, like this is just too hard what they're saying, I can't do it, I've tried that before, it doesn't work, you have to realize that habit change is hard. And one of the ways I always try to help people deal with this is the fact that like failure is part of the process, right? So you need to get that into your mind that you are going to fail. That is almost 100% guaranteed, right? So you don't need to look at that as a failure. You need to look at that as, oh, this is just part of the process. I'm going to mess up with this stuff. I'm going to encounter speed bumps. I'm going to get stuff 90% right. You have to be okay with that. You have to be able to go, okay, I'm still on the trajectory that I want to be on. These are just, meanders in the road, speed bumps, potholes, whatever analogy you want to use to help you with this. You need to get that into your mind, because the one thing that will derail everyone listening to this, if they're trying to bring in new habits, is if they have that all or nothing mindset, right? If you have this, oh, I have to be 1000% on point with this, or I might as well not bother. Like there's all the stuff we talk about in this episode, it's kind of irrelevant because you are not in the right frame of mind, the right mindset to be able to even help yourself. You're not even the same or the right frame of mind for someone else to be able to help you, because you think everything has to be perfect. And honestly, in your life, do an assessment right now. Where is anything perfect? Like, go to a shop, nothing's perfect. Go to, university, nothing's perfect. Go to your job, nothing's perfect. Your personal life, nothing's perfect. Anything that you do, there's nothing perfect. Like, you don't even make a sandwich perfectly. Like, you're trying to butter your bread and you're like genuinely, did you do that perfectly? No, you probably didn't. You did it good enough, right? You did good enough to get like the butter on the bread. It's like you didn't fill every single corner with exactly the right amount of butter. You didn't have the butter at the right temperature, the bread at the right, or toast at the right temperature, whatever, right? Like, nothing is perfect. So don't expect this one aspect to be perfect, especially if you've struggled with this in the past, right? Do you have anything to say there, Gary?
I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but something that people struggle to execute on nonetheless, because it is incredibly tempting to try to set up a plan that is as perfect and as optimal as possible. And this also ties in with what you might call the curse of knowledge, because the more you know about health behaviors and how to set things up optimally, the more likely you are to want to overwhelm yourself with things that you have to do. Easy examples of that would be personal trainers themselves often really struggle with health behaviors because they totally overwhelm themselves, because they feel an obligation to set up the most complicated program, the most complicated diet plan, to be extremely strict with themselves. They think sometimes that makes them a better trainer. They also think that maybe it makes them a better role model for their clients, when in fact, it often goes against what they might be telling their clients. They tell their clients to try to aim for flexibility, and having some freedom in your life and those types of things, but they can't execute on it themselves. So we understand the temptation, but what I would ask you is, rather than considering how difficult or how admirable the habits are to execute, instead focus on the outcome, because this is what people will do. They'll try to get a sense of reward from sticking to something that's really challenging, really difficult to do. An example that would be, if you're not a very early morning person and you're not productive in the morning, but you decide, oh, I saw Gary getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning or whatever, so I'm going to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. But you're totally wrecked for the day. Your performance is poor, but you're like, oh, I feel accomplished because I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning. You committed to something that you saw as being admirable, but didn't actually improve your life or lead to improved outcomes. So focus on the outcome that you're really aiming at. Take the least motivated version of yourself and consider that person when putting that habit in place. Because what we often do is we think about our most motivated selves. For example, it's 8 p.m. on a Sunday evening. You're planning out your week. You have the best intentions. Okay. You've been relaxed for the day. You're thinking, I'm going to do this, this, and this, all meals prepped, all workouts done at 6 a.m. in the morning. But then what you have to think about is, what about Thursday morning at 7 a.m. when it's dark? What about that person? Is that person going to do all of the things that you're setting out to do in the same way that the motivated Sunday evening person will? And very often the answer is no. So plan for that Thursday morning person when the quilt is heavy, it's cold outside, it's raining, it's dark, and you'll start to see positive outcomes from that.
100%. Getting me motivated here, Gary.
Let's go.
But yeah, it really does. It's really important to understand that the biggest thing to overcome here is not some like physiological thing. It's not some like, oh, you're going to have to overcome insulin resistance, or you're going to have to overcome XYZ, whatever buzzwords people use. That's not going to be the thing. The thing that's going to be hardest to overcome is the habit stuff. Both previously overcoming previous bad habits, quote unquote bad habits, and then also building new good habits. Both of those things are hard, right? And one of the really hard things about that is, at the start, it actually requires more time, right? And that's really hard to, it's really hard to see the future, because none of us can see the future, but it's really hard to see the future when you're like, Jesus, like the time commitment for doing all this stuff is so high. I have to prep my food. I have to do, go to the gym. I have to do X, Y, and Z, all these different things, right? But you have to remember that over time, you do actually get more efficient, right? You probably end up saving a lot of time on the back end if you actually set things up correctly. But at the start of it, it's going to require more time. You know, you don't have these habits built. You don't have an efficient process. You don't have everything like figured out for your schedule. You're not like, oh, like the kids are here or they're gone to bed and this is when I can do this. And like, you don't have all of that, like all the little tips and tricks. You don't have it all figured out, right? So it's going to require more time. And habit change in and of itself is a time intensive process. So you are both inefficient and you're trying to change your habits. You're going to stumble along the way. So there is a much bigger time investment at the start. And this is what derails the vast majority of people with this stuff, because they see all the time commitment at the start and they're like, oh, no, it's not for me. Can't do that, right? So like what Gary was saying, what we really need to do to overcome that is we need to focus on, like, first of all, like Gary said, your least motivated self, right? It's like, well, what's the minimum thing we can do? What's the minimum barrier where it's like, okay, we can actually just take a step forward. We can step over that barrier, right? And we can just consistently do that. Okay, now you're building your self-efficacy. You're building your ability to change habits because you've changed this habit. You know, you got rid of one of these things, and you know, now you've introduced this other good habit. So it does take time. And again, I would be lying to you if I was to tell you that it's going to be easy or that you're not going to be frustrated along the way. You're going to be frustrated. It's infuriating at times. However, you're just going to find yourself in a rhythm. You're going to find yourself slowly but surely moving in the right direction. And that's good enough. You don't need to be like, I got everything sorted in 1 week. I completely transformed my entire life around, you know? Cool. Some people need to do that. You know, if the doctor is giving you a wake-up call and been like, look, you're going to die in like a month's time unless you get your shit together, you're probably going to need to change things in a week, right? But if you're just looking at this going, you know, I'm not living the life that I wanted to live, this is not how I envisaged myself, you know, living, then you're going to need to take things a little bit slower. You're going to need to slowly but surely take away at the different habits, build new habits, get rid of old habits, etc., you know? So we can actually tackle this stuff from two angles, right? Like all the stuff that we want to talk about, right? And the first thing is we can tackle this from identifying the high yield items, right? And that's obviously really important because we want to focus. Look, I'm telling you, this is a time intensive process and we don't want to take more time than is necessary, right? So we need to focus on the high yield items. What's going to give us the best return on investment, okay? So we need to be able to identify them, and we'll go through that in a second, right? But then we also need to talk about this in the context of how do we actually integrate those habits or that thing into your life, right? So there's two things going on here. We could do this entire podcast and we could go, oh, we'll just focus on one or the other. We'll just focus on, you know, the actual habits, you know, and that's what a lot of people do. They'll focus on, oh, you need to get 8 hours of sleep per night, right? And they leave it at that. Okay. And like, that's fantastic. That's cool, right? We want to know we want to know what we're aiming towards, but we really want to know is how do we actually integrate that into our life? So we're going to touch on both of those, you know, two sides of the coin, so to speak. But ultimately, again, as I said earlier on, this is so much easier when I'm doing this one-on-one with a client because I can actually ask them questions. I can actually find out what their life is like. I can be like, okay, well, this is how we overcome this problem that you're encountering in your actual life. You know, it's very hard in this generalized format going, oh yeah, like sleep 8 hours per night, maybe, you know, go to bed a little bit earlier, blah, blah, blah. And this is why everyone and their grandmother always comes up with, yeah, but like, what about this one particular situation? I have to get up early for work and then I have to, you know, put the kids to bed and then I have to do my second job, and all, like, people come up with these things where it's like, yeah, obviously that person's going to 100% struggle with this habit or this thing that we're trying to focus on. You know, that's not representative of the vast majority of people. You know, like the vast majority of people actually have way more time than they think, right? Like you're sitting at home watching Netflix for 3 hours every single night, you know, and you could go, oh, I don't have the time. It's like, no, you actually do have the time. You know, you just aren't putting that time towards the stuff that, you know, we would argue is more important. Now, that's not to say you can't, you know, watch some Netflix, you can't watch some TV, relax, etc. But we're not talking about the outliers here. The outliers, they need specific help, right? The general population, the vast majority of people, we can actually just go, okay, this is how we can solve these issues in a generalized context, right? But anyway, first things first, we need to be able to identify the problem/problems, right? Because again, we're just talking about how to encourage health in older individuals. Like, again, incredibly broad, uh, like population group there. You know, we can have individuals that are still, you know, very active. They go out and do their exercise or whatever, but maybe their nutrition isn't where it needs to be. They're, you know, maybe there's someone has really good nutrition, but they're just not healthy, fit, in terms of like, you know, cardiovascular fitness, strength, whatever, right? Because there are a lot of things to focus on with all this stuff. So we need to be able to identify what's going on, right? What's the actual issue that we're trying to change? Is it just purely the activity that we're trying to change? Are we trying to change nutrition? Are we trying to change like sleep habits, stress management? What is it, right? And this is, you know, effectively where our business name comes from, Triage Method. You know, that's what we do. We go through, if we're doing with a client, we go, okay, here's all your issues. Let's actually triage this. These are your big ticket items. This is the thing that needs to be addressed first, because if we address this first, all of these other things fall into line, right? Or it allows you more capacity to deal with these things. For example, if you're sleeping 5 hours per night and you're like, oh, I'm so tired, I can't go to the gym, I can't, you know, push myself hard with that. I always find I'm really hungry, I binge eat, I do all this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, yeah, we could focus on improving nutrition and improving exercise habits, etc. But the big issue is that you're not sleeping enough. You know, or like someone's like, oh, I'm not building enough muscle. I put all the effort into the gym, and you know, I'm doing all this hard work, and you know, I just seem to gain fat. And we're like, okay, well, look, your stress management, like, it's non-existent, right? Your sleep habits, again, awful. You're just putting yourself in a terrible environment for productive muscle gain, productive performance. You know, so you can put all the work you want into training or nutrition, but if you're not actually giving yourself the chance to realize your potential, because, you know, you're stressed to the nines and you sleep 5 hours a night, it's like, okay, you're just going to get slower results, or you're just not going to get the results that you want, right? So we need to be able to identify the big ticket items and then address those, all right? And again, in a general context, I unfortunately can't identify your big ticket items. You need to go through that yourself. You need to go, okay, this is what's going on in my life. What's more important? We'll help you with that in a second, but you're going to have to go do that yourself, or inquire about coaching. Like, that's why we coach people. So big ticket item, keep that in mind, and then we're going to craft a plan around that, right? Now, the thing about that is, and it goes back to the habit-based change we've been talking about, it would be great if we could just, oh, here's your biggest ticket, let's get the sleep sorted, right? But that actually might be the most challenging thing to sort. It might be one of those things where it's like, okay, look, we know this is the big issue, but we need to build some momentum here. We need to build some wins. So we're going to focus on like easy wins. We're going to focus on some things that are actually easier for you to do, so that we can build that momentum to eventually be able to tackle the big thing. You know, you have low energy because your sleep is crap, for example. Like, okay, well, we can still work on the diet a little bit. We can still focus on, you know, stress management practices. We can still focus on, you know, exercise. We can still get you to a position where you're feeling a bit more energetic. You're feeling a bit more like, okay, I have more capacity to do things in your life. And then all of a sudden we can be like, okay, now we can start tackling the sleep, which then makes everything else much better, right? But anyway, so to identify the, whatever you want to call these, the big ticket items, you know, we effectively always talk about 4 things. We talk about sleep, stress management, exercise, and diet, right? They're your 4 big levers, right? And that's the way I like to contextualize this stuff as well, in terms of, you have these 4 levers, right? And they are determining a lot of the stuff that we do. And they're not the only levers. You've got these 4 big levers in this control room. You've got all these little buttons, and you have all this, like, you know, all this other stuff going on. Now, most people, unfortunately, focus on all the buttons, the shiny buttons over here. I'll press this one, I'll press this one. And it's all these minuscule things that, okay, yeah, they are part of the process, but they are giving you such a, like, small return on investment. You know, like, people would often say, you know, you're missing the forest for the trees, or you're majoring in the minors. That's effectively what most people do. And that's not necessarily bad, because that can be a catalyst for building that momentum. We're like, okay, you think you can do this thing? okay, we're going to do this thing, right? It's not going to move the needle in a huge amount, but at least it gives you a little bit of, okay, I can actually change. I can actually do something, right? So that's fine. But oftentimes, the more efficient way of going about this is to look at those four levers, right? And then look at how can we improve them? How can we get them to where we want them to be at so that we can actually get the results that we want, right? Now, the thing about this is we can work on all of those levers at once, right? And that's what most people try to do. They go, okay, I'm going to go in, I'm going to try moving all these levers at once. And that's fine. Like we can do that and we can move them to a certain degree, but we can also focus on one of them at a time. We can be like, right, we're going to work on this one thing. Once we've mastered that or got it to a really good place, then we're going to look at the other stuff, right? And we can do shades within that. We can be like, right, we're going to set some like baseline lever pulling with all four of these things, but we're really focusing on the sleep, or we're really focusing on stress management, or we're really focusing on exercise or diet. Like we can do that. And that's generally where I actually prefer to be at, where it's like, okay, we're going to set some baseline things and we're going to really focus and hone in on this one thing. But unfortunately, what most people do is they try to go hell for leather with all the things at once, right? So you have either people do either sides of the spectrum where they focus on the shiny buttons over here and they're like, okay, cool, yeah, they contribute. Or they go try to go all in and they try to get all four levers and try to pull them down all at once. And you're like, look, yeah, you can pull them down a little bit all at once, right? Because we can do this generalized shotguns, scatter approach, right? But you're going to get your best return on investment if you just go, right, let's just master this one thing, then we can move on. Do you have anything to say about that, young Gary, before we get stuck into the actual habits? Because this is what people want from the episode, because we've just been talking about fucking background theory or whatever for up until now. How do we actually start implementing this stuff into our life?
Yeah, so let's talk sleep, okay? Because sleep is something that if you can get it in order, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but if you can improve it, especially, he says as he yawns, especially if it's something that's an identified issue, whether you're constantly waking during the night, you never feel rested when you wake, you're not in bed for long enough. If you've identified those issues, then sleeping better is going to improve your stress management because you're going to be a little bit more resilient throughout the day. You're probably going to be a bit more productive and more likely to complete tasks and thus less likely to be stressed by them. From an exercise perspective, you're likely to recover better from exercise, be more motivated to exercise, and perform better when you are completing exercise. So again, sleep is going to facilitate that. And then finally, from the dietary side of things, we know that sleep deprivation increases cravings and the reward from hyperpalatable foods. So foods that are really tasty, your classic kind of junk foods, you're going to crave them a bit more when you're sleep deprived, and you're going to be less likely as a result to eat a high quality, healthy diet. It's also more difficult to keep your calories down as a result of that. So appetite is effectively dysregulated. So you can see that if you can get your sleep in order, all of the other areas will also improve. So in terms of sleep itself, then obviously sleep has a number of very important roles, including those related to aging. If we're talking about elderly individuals here, sleep restriction, if you're constantly sleep deprived, it might increase your risk of things like neurodegenerative disease, such as Alzheimer's disease or dementia. So it is something you do want to try to get in order. Sleep can also be compromised by a number of factors associated with aging. For example, in the postmenopausal period, in certain disease states, even Alzheimer's and dementive states, you can start to have changes in your sleep architecture as a result of that, or maybe medications you're on, or any of the other factors that can reduce sleep quality, such as financial stress, life obligations, maybe shift work or whatever it is you happen to be engaged in. We all have challenges that can reduce our sleep quantity and quality. So the best thing that you can do is to start to set up some sort of sleep schedule. And this has to be practical, because if you're, let's say, a 45-year-old lady, mother, who has kids at home still, kids are getting ready for school in the mornings and those types of things, you have to be considerate of what tasks you are obliged to complete. It might be that you drop the kids to school in the morning before you go to work. It might be that you prepare lunches, or maybe you help the kids bathe in the evening or get their clothes prepared, those types of things. Setting up your sleep schedule so that those things are facilitated rather than restricted is really important, because what a lot of people will try to do is set up a sleep schedule that is just completely not practical. So for example, they might decide, I want to be a morning person. I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. Fine, absolutely. If you can and that works for you, please go ahead. But if you work 8 hours back from that, let's say you're someone that really needs that 8 hours of sleep, then that's 9 p.m. And if you've still got, kids that are awake at 9 p.m., or your husband, wife, partner, etc., if they're still awake and they want you to do things, or you normally exercise in the evenings and it's difficult to wind down, then that sleep routine is not practical for you. And you're only going to be placing additional stress on yourself trying to adhere to it. So it might be the case that for you, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. might actually suit you better. So figure out a schedule that will work, figure out one that you can keep relatively consistent with, and then start to make that quite rigid. That's the best way to start off with this, is to actually be a bit more rigid with your sleep schedule, winding down before bed. If you've got a bedtime of 10 p.m., then there's no ambiguity about what you do at 9:30. When it's 9:30 and maybe there's a show on that you want to watch, or, you're thinking about what you'll do next. Will you go on the laptop? Will you watch a movie? None of that is there, because you're in bed for 10, you're asleep for 10. So you've got to now start your pre-bed routine. And having those things that are a bit more rigid in your life can allow you flexibility elsewhere and can allow you to plan your overall day a bit better. So that's the important thing. Set up a sleep schedule, make it practical, set up a pre-bed routine, which might be a winding down by reading a book. You might have one of those red lamps, which we got recently in our bedroom here, that, is quite relaxing. I think it looks like you're in some sort of porn movie or something, because it's just this weird red light and it's a weird vibe. But basically create a light environment, create a mood for sleep, complete activities that are relaxing, like reading rather than watching a hyped up movie, for example. You might enjoy something like meditation. I personally enjoy having some clarity on what I'm doing the next morning. So I might write it down in the notes in my phone, on a piece of paper, in my calendar or to-do list, just so that I have some peace of mind going to bed and waking up the next morning, that I know what I'm doing for the day, that I don't have these kind of wandering thoughts when I'm lying in bed of, oh, what do I need to do tomorrow? When am I going to do this? When am I going to do that? If I've got that clear from the night before, my day is a lot less stressful and it's a lot easier for me to get to sleep. So have a think about what might work for you within that routine. And when you're setting up that sleep schedule as well, think about the number of hours that you're trying to get. Okay. There's no point saying I'm going to get up at 4 a.m. if you're not going to get to bed until 11 p.m. and then you're only getting 5 hours of sleep, and that will catch up on you eventually. It'll be fine. It might be fine for a few nights, but for most people, that's not going to be sufficient. So think about the overall hours as well. Now, beyond just the pre-sleep period, it's important to look at other parts of your day as well. For example, some people are quite sensitive to water intake in the evening. And if they drink a lot of water in the evening, they'll wake during the night, which compromises sleep quality. So what you can do here is firstly start by hydrating more earlier in the day, because this is what we find quite a bit with clients, is that they'll get up in the morning, they'll have their breakfast, they'll go to the gym or whatever it is they do, but they're not drinking water. And they might not drink water throughout the day. And then what happens is at the end of the day, they're drinking a lot more because they have more free time, they have water freely available, and they're catching up on thirst that is accumulated throughout the day. And it's at that point then that they start to produce the most urine as a result. So clearly you're going to compromise your sleep quality. Whereas if you can hydrate more earlier in the day, in the middle of the day, and then taper a little bit in the evening, particularly if you're sensitive to it, that might help you out. Similarly, thinking about food in that period of time can also be helpful. So if you have more of your calories earlier in the day so that you're not, having 1,000 calories right before bed, that's quite likely as well to preserve sleep quality. Now, you don't want to take that too far, because sometimes hunger can also compromise sleep quality, particularly if you're already in a deficit or you've been dieting for a while. So in that case, I'd be more concerned about someone having a meal maybe in the 2 hours before bed, even if it's just something small, a carbohydrate-based snack. It can help with getting to sleep, but it can also ensure that you're not hungry going to bed, which can stop some people. And then the final thing related to the overall day is to address caffeine intake. Again, caffeine sensitivity varies quite a bit, but most people are not going to sleep as well if they're having caffeine into the evening time or even the late afternoon. So I'd say somewhere between 1 and 3 p.m., maybe 1 and 4 p.m., have your last coffee or your last dose of caffeine. I know some people have caffeine in the evenings before evening workouts, and they sleep, at least subjectively, very well, and they report no issues. If that's you, I mean, you're not necessarily harming yourself. If you're saying, I feel rested, I'm sleeping a perfect amount of hours, I'm getting to sleep on time, there still might be some minor impact on sleep quality. It could probably be improved, but mainly we're talking here about the people who really need to address this as a priority. So if caffeine is something that's potentially playing into your inability to get to sleep or stay asleep, then that's something to address. Finally, bit more difficult, or something that might require a bit more assessment. If you're someone who has sleep apnea, or you have suspected sleep apnea based on your bed partner's report, or maybe your own perception of waking up during the night feeling like you're gasping for breath, or you woke yourself up with your own snoring, or you might wake in the morning and have a really sore throat from snoring, or the back of your nose is irritated, those types of things. If you're noticing those as potential factors that are reducing sleep quality, that's something you can get assessed for as well, for sleep apnea. So that could be worth having a look at too.
Yeah, 100%. And the first thing on all of this is, like, the reason we started with sleep is because this is the thing that most people just ignore. This is the thing that, I have all these other habits that I need to integrate and I need to do. And then they just ignore sleep. They're like, oh, you know what? Actually, I'll just get 6 hours of sleep, 5 hours, 4 hours, And again, it means all the wheels fall off the wagon down the road with everything else because you're tired, right? So I know people listening to this are just going to ignore that and go, yeah, sleep's important, cool. And then they'll still sleep 6 hours per night, right? Don't do that to yourself. This is the thing. If you're like, I don't have enough time to, put into going to the gym or prepping my food or whatever, right? Would you have more time if you weren't actually fucking tired all day because you don't sleep enough? You're like, oh, this task just normally takes me 4 hours. And it's like, yeah, it's because you're half asleep while you're doing it. It's an hour-long task, right? So you end up being more productive if you get your 8 hours of sleep. Now, again, there are outliers. There are people that are just not going to be able to get this. They might have to do split shifts. They might have shift work in general. There's all different things that are going to stand in the way of this. But for the vast majority of people who work this kind of 9 to 5 life, you can get your 8 hours, like if you do, again, a 9 to 5, that's 8 hours in work. You're 16 hours outside of work. Even if you put a commute on both sides of that day, you've still got lots of time to do whatever the fuck you want to do, right? So you can get rid of 8 of those hours of sleep, But anyway, the only other thing that you forgot to mention, Gary, how disgusting, is reducing alcohol consumption as well, because that actually does destroy sleep for most people. Even though people say, oh, like, it helps me get to sleep. Same with like weed and other drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, it helps me get to sleep. And it's like, yeah, it might actually reduce that sleep latency, so you fall asleep much quicker. You're like, oh, actually, great, I fell asleep in 5 minutes versus the hour that it takes me normally. That's cool. That can be definitely helpful. However, the issue with that is it actually destroys your actual like sleep productivity. So you're getting sleep faster, but your sleep isn't good, right? And everyone always says that, they're like, oh no, I'm different, I still get good sleep and I have alcohol. And in every single study, every single time that you look into their, if it's an actual study, like their, the study details, you're like, okay, this is clearly your sleep is improved when you're not drinking alcohol. And then you actually look at the people, like say our clients and stuff, they might have something like a watch that tracks their sleep, and it gives the kind of sleep architecture. And you're like, okay, well, what happened this night? And you're like, oh, well, I had alcohol. And you're like, yeah, look, your sleep is shit here. Like, yeah, but I was great. Like I felt like I had a great night's sleep. And you're like, yeah, but you didn't. Like, this is not subjective. It's like you said, you felt like you had a great night's sleep, but then the next day your workouts were crap. Your resting heart rate was elevated, your HRV was destroyed, it was tanked, like all these other metrics. And it's like, yeah, like your subjective feelings and the objective data are different. And now we don't always, want to just go with the objective data. And there is, we want to have some of that subjective data in there as well. However, it's very hard to be subjective and actually, to be objective when you're actually going like, oh, well, actually, I like a little bit of alcohol and it makes you feel a little bit better. And then you have this like rose tinted glasses, view of, oh, that night's sleep was actually quite good, and it's like, no, it actually wasn't. But anyway, so sleep is the foundation. If you get your sleep sorted, it's going to reach into so many aspects of your life. And I would say the big high yield item here, if you're like, all right, I can't really do everything that Gary just said there, the big thing I would say is just create an actual sleep schedule, right? If you do nothing else, right, you don't even improve your pre-sleep routine. If you actually just take the time and go, right, I need to get 8 hours of sleep. 8 hours is the magic number here. Like, that's, most research shows it's somewhere between 7 and 9 hours for most people, right? So let's just say it's 8 hours, right? Because it's bang slap in the middle there, right? So you need to get 8 hours. Like Gary said earlier on, just work backwards. If you know you need to get up at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. or whatever it is, that means that you need to be asleep 8 hours before that, right? And for most people, especially, and you'll know yourself, if you have a hard time getting to sleep, that means you need to add a little bit more time on that. This is not 8 hours of just in bed, right? It's not 8 hours, oh, I take an hour to get to sleep, I have this like really like long sleep latency. That means you need to add an hour onto that 8 hours, so however long it takes you to get to sleep, like for me, literally takes a couple of seconds. Like I'm asleep like as soon as my head hits the pillow, right? So for me, I can basically just do 8 hours. I'm like, I know for me that's enough, right? I don't do that. I still add on half an hour of like, okay, let's wind down, let's get into the sleep state. But if again, you're going to take a long time to get to sleep, you need to have whatever, half an hour on top of that, right? And again, I understand this is not exactly the most easy thing to do, to just be like, right, I'm going to start going to sleep earlier, I'm going to actually get enough sleep. But it really does improve everything in your life. I mean, if you are someone that, you have your 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 job Monday to Friday, and then on the weekend, you actually want to do things, like, why are you using up your sleep earlier in the week? Or like you're not getting enough sleep earlier in the week, so you end up tired on your own time. Like that's the worst time to be tired, and that's what most people do. They get like 5 to 6 hours of sleep Monday to Friday, and then on the weekend they try to sleep in, get 12 hours of sleep on both days. And it's like, you literally just sold your own time. You sold your own time to catch up on sleep, which you don't really necessarily catch up on sleep. You should have just actually slept during the week. But anyway, I think everyone's aware now, sleep important, get it sorted, right? The next one then is just your baseline activity, right? So again, we're trying to give some sort of a roadmap for someone that's just trying to get back into activity, trying to be healthier. And we just fucking hammered them with you absolutely must get 8 hours of sleep per night, right? A lot of people, we started with that because I know half the people listening to this are just going to ignore it regardless. But anyway, after that, the next thing we're going to do. So if you're, again, a personal trainer, maybe you're trying to get someone to be a bit more active, trying to, encourage a client to be healthier. Like if they're coming to a personal trainer, they're probably, they want to exercise. They probably want to, be in the gym, do that kind of stuff. But let's just say you're a personal trainer and your parents, you're trying to get them more active, right? Or again, you're a 40-year-old and you're like, I just want to get a little bit more active. I used to be able to do this, or maybe I was never able to do this, but I just want to get to this, get healthier, right? We don't need to go balls to the wall from the off. We can actually just start increasing our general baseline activity, or our baseline exercise, if you will. And that actually does a huge amount for your overall health, right? And this is something that you can do as, again, a 70-year-old woman in a lot of cases. Obviously there might be limitations or whatever. We'll come to that in a minute. But a lot of you are just going to be able to increase your baseline activity, and that's going to significantly impact your health, right? And we talked about this stuff before, so we're not going to go too in depth with this. But ultimately, the easiest way to do this is to just increase your general activity levels. And the way we often, keep track of this is just keeping track of steps, right? So if you have an activity watch or an activity tracking watch, or an activity tracker on your phone or whatever, like that's a great place to start, right? So if you don't already have one of those like activity tracking watches, or a smartphone or whatever, like go out, get a pedometer, do something. It really doesn't matter. All you want to do is be able to keep a track of this, right? Because if you're not able to keep track of it and you've never done this stuff before, it's not like you're going to know where, like a good level is at, or a bad level is at, or like you don't know where you're at, right? So you need to just have something that you can keep track with. So again, pedometer, step tracking on your phone or a watch, whatever, right? And then what we do is we just set some sort of ambitious but achievable goals, right? So whatever you're doing currently, get your or pedometer or watch or whatever and go, okay, what am I currently doing? You might be like, okay, cool, it's actually 1,000 steps per day, which is not unheard of for someone who works predominantly in an office. 1,000 steps, or maybe walking around their house, going to the bathroom throughout the day, and then the rest of the time is spent in the car commuting, and then actually in the office. So you might be at 1,000 steps per day, right? We don't necessarily want to just go in straight away and go, all right, you need to get 10,000 steps per day, right? Like that's clearly unrealistic from where you're at. So what we just do then, we're like, okay, can we do 2,000? How does that change your life? Okay, you have to park a little bit further away from the office. You have to actually, do a little bit more walking. You have to be a concerted effort of like, I'm going to use the stairs rather than using the elevator. But ultimately, you want to just, get the activity up just a little bit, right? And then we start going, okay, you've got that habit. You've got that really starting to, you're in a good rhythm with that. Let's bump that up. Then we might go straight to 3,000, or we could go to 2,500. But effectively what we want to do is we want to have that goal, like the target of your baseline exercise or baseline activity. We want to have that just ever so slightly out of reach. It's like, okay, 2,500 is just a little bit, you have to actually think about this stuff. You have to be like, okay, I'm actually going to go for a little bit of a concerted walk here. I'm going to make sure that I, go hand deliver these papers to my office worker over here or whatever, rather than just like, I don't know, emailing them. I don't know, whatever way. I don't work in an office. I don't know how it works. So you just need to have that kind of ambitious but achievable goal. And then we kind of just chase that. We constantly push that out until we're at a level where we're like, okay, this is a good level to be at. Most people would say, okay, 10,000 steps per day, but that's not necessarily necessary. We might be able to go, okay, for you, 5,000, 7,000, whatever. We just want to get it to a good level. Now, most people are going to benefit from, going for a walk or having some sort of concerted exercise period. Like, oh, I go for a half an hour walk or whatever, purely because that gets them into the mindset of, well, first of all, actually doing this stuff rather than just letting it happen by a byproduct of their day-to-day life, which is, we do want that, but we also want to make sure that you are getting into a rhythm of, okay, I am a person that does some form of exercise, right? And that exercise, it might just be walking, but at least you're starting to realign your identity as, I am someone that exercises, right? Because that's actually really beneficial, right? And then again, we can just start trying to incorporate different movements throughout the day, just, taking the stairs, doing all that kind of stuff. And as I said, like setting aside some time for activity, I think that's beneficial. And it's also very achievable for most people. Again, if you're a 45-year-old father of two, it's still like that, this stuff that we just talked about there in terms of getting your baseline activity in a good place, very achievable. You set some step target goals. You maybe have to go for a concerted, okay, I'm going to, go for a 30-minute walk, or, your hour-long break for lunch in work. You're like, okay, I'm going to walk for 30 minutes there, and I'm going to, whatever, go to the shops and get my food, or whatever, I don't know, whatever it is, right? Like you're going to have periods of time in the day where you're like, okay, I have time to actually allocate to improving my baseline activity, right? So that would be a next step. So you got your sleep sorted, right? And again, I know everyone's skipping that, but the next thing then is, let's just get some baseline activity going. Where are we at? Oh, you're already at 10,000 steps per day. You're already quite active throughout the day. Okay, let's move on to the next thing, right? But for most people that aren't that active or whatever, just baseline activity. Do you mind to say on that, young Gary?
Yeah, just that this is increasingly important with aging, because we know that people typically reduce their steps as they age. Part of this is to do with, their general lifestyle, but a lot of it then, particularly into 60s, 70s and beyond, is due to declines in function and fitness that are somewhat self-fulfilling, because effectively what people will do is they'll get help from others. So people will be kind and people will help you do things like your shopping and things like that. They might give you lifts places, particularly if you're older. And this naturally reduces your step count per day, and reduces the amount of activity you do, like stairs, carrying shopping bags, all those types of things. And this can unfortunately have the effect of making your decline in function even quicker. So it's really important that you keep that up. We see that as well, like more objectively in terms of in elderly men, there's been some research on the number of steps taken per day and average levels of muscle protein synthesis. So we know that if your steps are lower, you've got lower average levels of muscle protein synthesis. And when we already know that muscle protein breakdown or catabolic processes are accelerated with aging, then you're going to have an accelerated decline in muscle mass, bone mass, and muscle strength, and thus overall health and function if you're not taking enough steps per day. So it's a fairly basic introductory intervention, but don't underestimate its importance and value.
100%. And then, so you got that. You do all the habits that are just, get some activity in. And then you're like, okay, well, what's the next step? The next step, we start looking at the diet, right? Some people will be like, oh, well, maybe we'll just start really hammering down on actual, organized activity. But in our mind, I would say the diet, you could argue the diet before baseline activity, but in my mind, I'm like, look, you can slowly be working on the diet while you improve your baseline activity. You can still be doing both of these at the same time, but when you really have baseline activity sorted, then we can go, right, now let's hammer home on the diet, right? So the way we do this, again, we're not going to go through this really in depth because we've done 1,000,001 podcasts on all this stuff. So I know people who are regular listeners, they don't want to hear the same stuff over and over again. So we're going to do a little bit of a tick the box type thing. And the unfortunate thing about that is the diet is probably the hardest area in terms of an actual habit change process. So again, if we were talking to clients one-on-one, this is probably where we'd spend the most time. Probably be like, okay, this is how we're going to do this. This is how we're going to overcome this issue. This is how we're going to do this, blah, 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 all the way through. But again, in this generalized context, I unfortunately can't do that for you. But I do recognize that this stuff, it's going to be very, very hard to actually get into a good rhythm with this stuff and actually start implementing better habits with this stuff, right? So how do we do it? Well, we want to improve the diet. So how do we do that? We want to become more aware of calories, right? It's, a baseline thing. It's just like, okay, we want to know, you don't necessarily need to track all your calories and macros and all that kind of stuff, but you want to have an awareness of what calories actually are, right? Because if you don't have that, you kind of get left just focusing on relatively good practices, but also poor practices at the same time, like very restrictive style of eating, where it's like, oh, well, the only way you know how to manipulate your calories or your overall energy content from the diet is by just excluding food groups or excluding entire foods, whatever, right? So you want to have some awareness of calories. You want to go, you can do this a number of ways. Excuse me. You can do this by just tracking, you can actually just get an app and I know, 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, I'm like, oh, well, how do I do that? But I think most tracking apps are, first of all, they're pretty intuitive to use. And I think that most 60, 70-year-olds these days are, fairly well able to use technology. It's kind of redundant. It's kind of arrogant, I don't know what the word is, to be like, oh, well, obviously we can use technology, but you old folk can't. That's just not the case. If you're 60, 70, 80, most old people can use technology these days, right? Yep. So some sort of tracking app, that can be fantastic. If you really want to go old school with it, there are literally books of the calories of different food, and you want to search that stuff up, be my guest. I think the internet and algorithms and all that kind of stuff do it much, much better than me having to look through this book being like, where's the broccoli? But anyway, so learn to track in some way as a proxy or a proxy for learning to understand calories, right? We generally want to move people away from calorie tracking. We want to move them more to portion-based approach and more does this look like it's the right amount of food for you, given your goals, etc. But a baseline process of that, or a foundational process of that, is actually understanding calories. And I find the quickest way to understand calories is to just track your food, right? It gives you that immediate feedback of oh, wow, I didn't realize that chicken had this much protein in it, or I didn't realize that, this food had this much fat in it, or whatever it is, right? It's really, really illuminating, right? So become aware of calories. You can read the back of labels if you want. That's a good way as well. But ultimately, it's a little bit hard because you have to keep it in the context of your overall day. And it's not like, oh, I read the milk carton earlier on and it told me I had whatever 1.6 grams of fat in this. And it's you're not going to remember that at 9 p.m. at night. You'd be like, how much fat was in that? Unless you write it down somewhere or whatever, right? But anyway, so we want to become aware of calories, and then we want to start making better food choices that align with the calories that we want to eat. Right now, finding out how much calories you want to eat. Again, we've talked about this before. It's a little bit of an arduous process. You can use one of these calorie calculators online or whatever, but ultimately, you know what you have been eating, or at least you have an idea of what you have been eating, what a normal day looks like for you. And if you're like, oh, I need to lose a little bit of weight, or I want to gain a bit of muscle or whatever, we can start manipulating the diet to allow that to occur, right? If we're trying to lose a little bit of weight, we're probably going to have to eat a little bit less. So if you're like, okay, I didn't know exactly how many calories I was on, but I knew I was eating, whatever, a lot. I need to eat a little bit less than that if I want to lose some weight, right? If you're maybe saying, I want to build some muscle, I want to get back into the gym, I want to get back performing, maybe we need to increase your protein. We might not, because some people do actually just spontaneously eat sufficient protein, but generally speaking, a lot of people just don't, right? So we might have to manipulate things. And again, we're not going to go into it too much here because we've talked about this before. It gets kind of boring. But ultimately, we want to start making better food choices that align with the actual goals that we have. Again, if it's fat loss, we're just going to go, okay, look, I have an idea of calories now. I realize that X, Y, and Z here that I normally eat, they're actually pretty high in calories. So I'm actually just going to swap them out for something that's lower in calories. Boom, calories are reduced in the diet. It becomes easier. That's the first step. We want to have an idea of calories. We want to start manipulating it then, right? What I will say about this as well, because people always do this when they start a new diet, like your diet doesn't need to change to be a completely foreign diet, right? It doesn't need to be completely different. Like I'm sure you get this as well, Gary. Like your client will come in and be like, oh, like, how do I change my diet? What should I be changing here? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, you don't need to completely revamp the diet. It doesn't need to be something that you've never eaten before, something completely different. You can just manipulate the quantities of the food that you're currently eating. It's like, oh, I'm eating a little bit too much potatoes, or that's actually a bigger portion than I actually need. Oh, that's 200 grams. Jesus, I didn't realize that was that much. I should actually only be eating like 150 grams or whatever, or like one scoop or whatever the fuck it is, right? But you can basically just manipulate the quantities of the food that you're currently eating. You don't need to be like, oh, well, I need to go out and eat this, passion fruit, mango smoothie thing that you're like, I've never eaten this before in my life, right? So I do want to make that clear because, again, and as I said, Gary, I'm sure you've seen this before with a lot of clients. They just, I've probably done it myself, where you think, oh, there's some foods that I'm missing out on that I should be eating, or there's a secret here, like there's a reason that they eat these foods or whatever, and you see this all the time on social media. Some influencer or whatever will start eating a certain food, or like they put on their story, they're like, oh, I have blueberries in my porridge or whatever, and people are like, oh my god, well, why are you eating blueberries? Like, are the blueberries a secret? And people start copying that as if it's like, this is the secret, and it's like no, blueberries in your porridge is nice now, don't get me wrong. Do you mind to say on that, young Gary?
Yeah, I mean, this is particularly important in older individuals, because what you have to realize is that if someone is 65, they've probably been eating mostly the same foods for maybe 4 or 5 decades. Okay. So as we become older, we're generally going to be a bit more conservative, a little bit more resistant to overhauling the way that we live. In your 20s, you might play around with a lot of different diets, you're trying new foods, it's kind of trendy. Whereas if you're older, that's probably not the case. You might be shopping in the same local store, buying the same produce for 40 years or 10 years or 20 years or whatever it happens to be. So starting with that base is really important. And it's important to consider here as well, I think, the cultural aspects of dietary choice. And I don't just mean macro culture, like in terms of, oh, do they eat an American diet or a Mediterranean diet? But I mean more like micro culture, you could say, related to, for example, class or socioeconomic status. So if someone is 65 and they lived in a working class neighborhood all their lives, and now they're getting into managing their fitness a bit more, like telling that person to consume a poached salmon and avocado salad with pomegranate seeds, like, is going to sound absolutely ridiculous. Like, you serve that up to my grandfather, he wouldn't know what it was. So it makes it, you have to think about those things, particularly with elderly individuals, because it just makes no sense to try to totally overhaul everything. So for example, if it's an older Irish man, he's probably going to eat quite a bit of red meat. So it might be a case of maybe choosing leaner cuts of red meat, educating them on what those leaner cuts are, maybe how to cook them a bit better. It might be that they always eat their potatoes mashed with loads of cream and butter. And you might educate them on how to maybe have a baked potato or mashed potato with maybe just a half the amount of butter and maybe half fat cream or something along those lines, or a bit of milk instead. So there's different ways that you can take the type of diet that someone consumes and has been consuming for a long time and make those subtle changes in line with the overall dietary principles. So if we're trying to reduce someone's calories, we can start by, keeping in their toast in the morning, but maybe we'll have a little bit less butter. Keeping in maybe their fry on a Saturday morning, but instead of frying it in as much oil, they use a fry light spray. They have bacon medallions instead of standard rashers. They might have lower fat sausages, etc. So we're not totally overhauling. We're respecting the way that they've lived for all these decades, and we're making subtle changes that will make the decades hereafter even better for them. So I think that's particularly important in this cohort.
1,000%. And the next thing then is we generally want to have a better spread of calories than most people currently do with their diet. And what I mean by this is, like, most people just skip breakfast and have a massive dinner. And like, that's, it can be fine. But it kind of goes along with poor lifestyle practices. Like, people will just skip breakfast, rush out of the house and have a lunch, just something on the go. And then they come home and they're absolutely ravenous. They have like their normal dinner and they're like, I'm still hungry. They have the half a tub of Ben and Jerry's, the full tub. And then, it generally leads to poor lifestyle practices to eat this way. It can be done quite well. But in general, people who are not tracking their diet, not tracking their calories and macros, like, if you don't have a good spread of calories, it's generally not good. And we can talk about stuff like, the circadian style dieting, where it's like, it's probably better to eat more in the morning and less later on in the day. But ultimately, we don't need to go down that route. We just need to go, okay, you probably want to have a better spread of your calories throughout the day. Have some sort of breakfast, lunch, dinner, and maybe some snacks, right? But also, and this is important, have a plan for all of them, right? The amount of people, and again, I'm sure you see this with your clients as well as I do, Gary, where people just don't have a plan for their breakfasts or their lunches or their dinner. And then they either do one of two things. They either eat the same thing, it's just like, all my breakfasts are the exact same, which is not a bad practice. I'm not giving out about that. Or they just try to do everything on the fly. They're like, okay, I'm going to have a breakfast, lunch, and dinner today. But everything's different every single day. And it's like, let's just try to track calories and macros. And all of a sudden you're like, wow, like your diet is literally all over the place. There's no consistency in the amount of protein intake, carbohydrates, fats, or whatever whatsoever throughout the day, or from day to day even, because you're just doing this on the fly. There actually is no consistency to this. We want to have a plan. You want to have some sort of structure, and then it's much easier to actually, first of all, get the results you want, but also, and this is probably the most important thing for a lot of people, to actually have energy throughout the day, right? Like, I don't understand how people miss the connection between what they eat and how they feel, because everyone is aware that there is that connection, right? Because if you don't eat, you feel hungry and all that kind of stuff. And also, everyone is aware, most people at least these days, that you're like, I get my energy from food. I get calories give me energy, right? And it's obviously not as simplified as that, but ultimately that is effectively how it works. So why would you think, if you don't sort out how your diet is spread throughout the day, how do you think you're going to have good energy throughout the day? But anyway, that's a bit of an aside. Ultimately, we want to spread those calories out throughout the day in a relatively uniform way. We're not like hyper focused on one side of the day or other, right? Unless you have anything to say on that, Gary, no?
No, that's all good.
Fantastic. And then some really helpful habits. We're just going to fly through these. Eat more fruit and veg. Again, we talk about this all the time. It's literally on all the healthful diets that you'll read online or see in studies, they all seem to eat fruit and veg. So let's get that sorted, right? Again, a few little practical tips on this, because I do want to make this applicable to people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Just buy frozen veg. Like, prepping takes time. Just buy frozen veg. Literally so easy. You can put it in a bowl, in a microwave, done in whatever 2 minutes or however long it takes. You can boil it. You can do so many different things with this, right? So just buy frozen veg, save yourself so much time, right? Learn new recipes that incorporate fruit and veg. Again, a little bit more of a time commitment, and also again, kind of goes against what we were saying earlier on, where you're like, your diet doesn't have to change massively, but ultimately, if there's going to be one change, let's make it incorporating more fruit and veg, right? Could be learning to make smoothies. It could be making, I don't know, fruit salads, different things, right? Like, we ultimately just want to find ways to incorporate more fruit and veg into our life, right? And same thing again with snacks. Like, you can switch out snacks for fruit, perhaps, and that can be quite effective for bumping up your overall fruit and veg intake. And then, unless you're anything to say on that, Gary, the next thing then is eating more protein. A lot of people, they just don't eat enough protein. So we want to find ways to incorporate more protein in the diet. And again, this is going to be something that you're going to struggle with, and something we talk about with our clients when we're helping them with this stuff on a specific basis. But ultimately, we want to have a good spread of that protein throughout the day. So you're going to need to come up with solutions to, how am I going to get more protein in at the breakfast, time period? How am I going to get it in at the lunchtime period, the dinner? Like, most people, what they do is they just have protein at dinner. That's the only time they have protein, or a significant amount of protein. And ideally, we want to have a bit more of a spread. So that might mean that you're having some sort of, I don't know, high protein, like a Greek yogurt or something for breakfast. You're having maybe, I don't know, a protein shake. That's obviously, a lot of 70-year-olds, they're not going to be like, oh yeah, give me that Optimum Nutrition protein shake over there, but ultimately, we want to find ways to get more protein in throughout the day. It is generally good for health. Now, again, this is not to say you need to be consuming bucket loads of protein, but a lot of people are just not consuming enough protein. And even if they are consuming enough protein, they're not getting that spread throughout the day, right? And then finally, as well, we want to just reduce saturated intake, if I can even speak, saturated fat intake. And rather than just thinking of like, oh, fat is bad, what we just generally focus on is swapping out stuff like butter for olive oil and stuff like that, right? So that's a diet. Look, there's so much we could go into with the diet. It's not like that's the be all and end all, but ultimately that's what we want to be thinking about. Now, how do you actually put that in? Like, how do you actually implement all of that stuff into your life? It literally all boils down to having a plan for this stuff. Like, it's just not going to happen spontaneously. If you don't plan for this stuff in your individual specific life, it's not going to happen, right? And you can easily just write this off and go, look, I don't have the ability to do this, the time, the whatever. And that might be the case. But if that is the case, you even more need a plan of action, right? If you don't have the time, you need a plan of action. You can't even you're saying you don't have the time to do this stuff, then you definitely don't have the time to be faffing around thinking about, oh, well, what am I going to have for my breakfast? Or what am I going to have for my lunch? You need to have that. If you're saying you're time poor, you need to have, this is my exact plan. This is what I'm having Monday to Sunday. I have all my meals planned out. I know what I'm doing. I know it ahead of time. Because if you're time poor, that saves you so much more time. Like, if you, and I'm sure, again, you've seen this with your clients as well, Gary, where people will literally spend hours per day thinking about what they're going to have, I'll try to hit my calories with this, and I'll try to do this. And I was like, you're spending so much time on this stuff. Just create a plan. Even if you want to change the plan every week or day or whatever it is, but just create the plan once and then execute on it, if you do that with the diet, create a plan, even a bad plan is better than nothing, right? So do you mind to say on the diet front, young Gary?
No, that's the diet covered. And the next thing is, of course, more formal exercise. So you've gotten started with your basic daily activity, and that's a really important start. But thereafter, what you want to try and do is ramp it up a bit. Okay, so it's really important as you age that you do your best to maintain or even gain muscle and strength, along with bone mass, but they tend to go together. Okay, so the things that are going to increase your muscle mass and your strength are generally going to also contribute to increases in bone mass. So there's some crossover there between bone and muscle. It's really important here that you start quite simply. And resistance training for an elderly person could be as simple as sit to stands from your chair. Okay, starting from a high chair, doing a squat-like movement to stand up. You can progress towards a lower chair. You can progress towards holding a dumbbell, and then you can progress towards things like your barbell squats, your leg presses, etc. So it doesn't have to be anything too complicated. It doesn't even have to involve a gym to start with. And if you work with a competent trainer, they should be able to give you a program that you can complete in your home. You know, if you're very untrained, even you can do sit to stands from a chair. You can do wall push-ups. You can do chair push-ups. There's loads of different exercises that can be done with zero equipment and just your body weight. So it doesn't have to be about getting to the gym. Now, I would recommend attending a gym because you can gain a lot more skills. You have a lot more freedom, a lot more options to progress. And also, if you get the assistance of a personal trainer, whether it be during the intake process of joining a gym. Some gyms will, have a trainer show you around the gym, show you how to use different exercises, etc., and have a look at your technique. That's one option. The other option would be to actually hire a trainer for a period of time to get you comfortable with the gym environment and the different machines and exercises that you're doing. And the most important thing really is that when that trainer prescribes a program for you, or you follow your own program, that you start light with everything. Okay, 2 to 3 times per week is more than enough as a starting point, training all major muscle groups. But you don't need to go in on day one and go 100% effort, because you'll just leave yourself feeling really sore and potentially even discouraged about going back to the gym again. Because if you go home and you're already maybe a little bit deconditioned, if you're in your 70s, your 80s, and your mobility isn't as good as it once was, and you go to the gym and then it leaves you in such agony that you can't do anything around the house for subsequent days, then you're probably not going to want to go back. So starting nice and easy, it might be a 15 to 30-minute weight training session where you're just learning the technique. You still might be a little bit sore, but it shouldn't be crippling. Okay, so that's really important. Another thing that's really important is that you're preserving your aerobic fitness or cardiorespiratory fitness into later life. Now, doing some resistance training is going to support you developing that, but you can also add in some more dedicated work. So what I would envisage here is someone starting with maybe 30 minutes of resistance training and then doing 15 minutes of maybe some cycling on a stationary bike, maybe some rowing, walking on an inclined treadmill, something like that to finish off your workout, because it basically means that you can couple those things together. That'll be a really good starting point, and then you can start to build that up over time. You might attend an exercise class once your fitness is at that level. You might have dedicated cardio sessions that are a bit longer, or you might even, take up a hobby like cycling at the weekend or something along those lines, or swimming. Those low impact activities are particularly popular with older age groups. So you've got plenty of options there, but that's where I would be starting with those components of exercise. Now, one other thing to consider here is that if you are older, you're more likely to have what might be referred to as degenerative injuries or degenerative musculoskeletal conditions, such as maybe arthritis in your knees or your hips or your back, maybe little injuries that you picked up over the years, maybe a bit of backache, those types of things. This is completely normal. It's expected with aging that we'll pick up little niggles, little bits of pain here and there. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't train. Generally, training is going to help you out. It's probably going to reduce your pain and give you strength to overcome those limitations in future, but it may require some short-term changes in the way that weight training is planned. So for example, if you've got hip or knee osteoarthritis, you might want to identify where in the range of motion it is provoked most and on what exercises. So a classic example would be, let's say someone has hip osteoarthritis. It's quite sore in deep hip flexion. So for example, the bottom of a squat or the bottom of a leg press. So what we might do is have the person squat to a box that's a little bit higher so that they're not going into the range of motion that is causing them the greatest amount of pain. And that then allows them to build up strength, build up tolerance, build up muscle in and around that hip that will potentially give them the tolerance to go a bit deeper in future, even though it's not necessarily required. Okay, so there will be a bit of tweaking with any exercise program that is designed for elderly people, particularly if you're have those conditions such as arthritis or others. But it absolutely can be done, and it's almost certainly of benefit. Okay, so you don't want to just avoid training muscles because you've got a bit of pain in that area, because it's quite normal and expected for someone who's in their 50s, 60s, 70s, etc., to be dealing with at least a few niggles here and there.
100%. Even in your 30s, like you see
Yeah.
people are like, all right, I want to return to exercise, and I haven't been exercising in the last 10 years, 15 years, whatever it is. And for them, the exact same processes apply. It's like, okay, how do I get back into activity? Take it a little bit easy, go a couple of times per week. You don't need to go into, oh, well, when I was 17, I used to go 6 times per week in this like legs push pull, fucking program. It's like that. You don't need to jump back into that. Go a couple of times a week, handful of times, 2 or 3, whatever it is. Just do full body work, build in some aerobic training. You could maybe push some anaerobic stuff, do some sprints and stuff like that. It has a lot of limitations, especially if you aren't used to pushing yourself that hard. And I would definitely do that on something that is like safer, such as like a stationary bike or something. I wouldn't be going, I'm just going to do some sprints on the treadmill here, having not run or anything in the last 10 years. And it's the same with the injury stuff. Like, you're going to have little niggles here and there, and ultimately you want to create a system where you acknowledge that that is part of the process, but you want to create a system that slowly brings you back to where you want to be. Again, you might have to do, like Eric said, like limited ranges of motion. You might have to accept, like, okay, this is just where my body is at now, and I'm going to build it up over time. But anyway, that I think covers the exercise. The final piece of the puzzle here is the stress management stuff. Now, stress management, again, runs the gamut. Like, there's so much in this that we could be talking here all day, right? But ultimately, we want to just create some stress management practices, because this is stuff that people just don't do. Like, if I was to poll listeners of this podcast and go, do you do any stress management practices? The vast majority of people would say no. Or if they were to say yes, and you actually ask them what those stress management practices were, they actually just do stressors for stress management, which to an extent works. But a lot of people would be like, oh yeah, I just go to the gym for stress management. It's like, okay, like that, it definitely does make you more resilient to stress, but putting your body under more stress to deal with stress is not necessarily the most effective way long term, right? So we actually want to have some stress management practices. And again, I couldn't tell you the amount of clients that I've talked about this stuff with, and they just don't implement on it, because this stuff is actually hard, right? And it seems like it's not effective. It seems like, oh, I don't need to do that. For me, that's just not for me. I don't need to do this, right? Oftentimes it's the very people that are like, oh, I don't need to do that need to do this the most, right? So look, stress management, first of all, it generally gets better with better sleep and diet practices. And if you do some exercise, you generally feel less stressed as well. So this is why it's last on the list, because even though it actually permeates into all of the other aspects and also influences the results you get with all the other things, it kind of is the last piece of the puzzle that you need to focus on, right? Unless obviously, you're hyper stressed and you can't get to sleep as a result, or you're hyper stressed and you can't stick to your diet. I don't know, whatever it is, right? But generally speaking, if we do the other things first, stress management becomes better. And then also when we start focusing on stress management, the other things become better, right? First things first, the easiest way to manage your stress is to actually organize your life and get better at planning and scheduling, right? Everyone hates it. It's like doing a budget, everyone's like, oh, I'm worried about money. And I'm like, oh, well, what's your budget like? I don't have one. Like, it's literally the entry point, right? So if you are worried about money, budget. Where's your budget at, right? That's the same with, stress management. If you have stress, you're higher stress, or you are someone that's like, I'm more prone to having higher stress and I don't have any stress management practices. The entry point, you need to actually sit down and organize your life and actually plan things out and schedule it, right? Like, if you have 1,000,001 things to do and you have no list even of those things, you're always going to feel anxious. And the anxiety is not because you have all these things to do. It's because you're fucking scared of even just forgetting one of them, because you're like, Jesus, I have 1,000,001 things to do. And it's all just in your head. So if you're not focusing on it at all times, you're going to forget about it, right? Or you might forget about it, right? That's why stuff like just journaling and stuff, which we'll talk about in a second, is so effective. You just write down these thoughts. Now they don't have to be in your mind. It was one of the greatest inventions of humanity, creating the written word, so use it. If you just write this stuff down and then start organizing, going, okay, these are my high priority tasks, need to do this, and then start scheduling it out, right? And obviously it depends on what type of stress we're talking about. If you're stressing over your child in hospital or whatever, like obviously that's a different type of stress, but the vast majority of people, the stresses in their life are just the stresses of daily life, so they can be systematized, they can be organized, they can be scheduled out. You can be like, I can create a plan of action for these things, so do it, write them all out, plan it out, schedule it out. Oh, this needs to be done on a Thursday, this needs to be done on a Saturday. Oh, these things are more important, I'm going to prioritize these things and push the other things out till next month, whatever it is. The vast majority of people, if they just did that, would be so much less stress. And again, stress management along with sleep, I know this is the thing that people heard us talk about stress management straight away, and they're like, all right, that's that podcast done, see you later. It's over, right? They just skip through it, they don't listen to it. People just don't implement on the stress management tactics, and they just stay stressed. Some people find comfort in the stress. They're kind of like, oh well, I like being the busy person. And there's a difference between being busy and being stressed. Like, stressed people aren't very productive people in general, right? Firstly, because they're always running around, like a headless chicken, but then also because they die at 50 because of the high stress. So you lost out on fucking 50 extra years of potential productivity and, the whole life thing that you wanted to do because you were so stressed, right? The next thing then, and we're not going to go too much into it because we're not psychologists or therapists or whatever, but you need to learn better coping mechanisms, right? Like, a lot of people turn to food, drugs, exercise to just numb their stress, right? To just numb their life, right? So you need to come up with better coping mechanisms. You need to actually develop healthful practices and not just try to, again, medicate away the stress in your life, right? There's a few things that are a little bit more, coherent in terms of what we can do, such as journaling. People, again, they're like, oh, well, what do I journal? It's literally just like Gary said, like, he basically journals, even though he might not call it journaling, where it's like, at the end of the day, okay, this is what happened today. Oh, I did well with this, didn't do well with this. This is what needs to be done tomorrow. I have a plan for tomorrow. Cool. Like, that's effectively journaling, right? You can go more in depth. You can be like, oh, well, these are my thoughts, my feelings, whatever today. And that's one way to do it. But ultimately, all we're doing here is writing stuff down, going, okay, well, this is how I'm feeling. This is what I did. This is what I have to do. And it's effectively just a way to get all this stuff off your chest, get all this stuff out of your mind, and have it stored somewhere else. You don't even ever need to look at that stuff in the future, but ultimately it's just kind of going, okay, this is not swirling around in my mind now, right? The other thing, then we can do some sort of meditation. And again, I know everyone always thinks like, oh, it's just woo woo, see you later. Like, well, I think I touch on that. Meditation can be quite effective. It's repeatedly shown to be very effective. It does have a little bit of a barrier of entry into it, in terms of, first of all, you have to get over that kind of, oh, like, why should I meditate? But that's just because of the way you've been introduced to meditation. Like, you could say, like, both myself and Gary do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that's a kind of meditation, because you have to be completely in the moment, present while you're doing Jiu-Jitsu. Like, you can't just be like, oh, I have to do this other thing later on. I have to, what am I going to have for food? Or, this thing I have tomorrow. Like, you can't do that. You can't check your phone. You can't do any of that kind of stuff. You have to be present. You have to be in the moment, right? And that's all effectively what a meditation is. It's just bringing you back into the moment, giving you something to focus on, and not focusing on the million and one other things that are going on in your life, right? And the other thing, which is very much related to that, is just mindfulness. There's a lot of different mindfulness practices. We're not going to get into them. I'm just giving you some sort of like quick hitter. These are things you can do. And there's also like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Like, you can go to a therapist for that. There are some like online stuff as well, but it's probably best with an actual therapist. And then engage in self-care. I know on social media, everyone's like, oh, I'll do some of my self-care. And they literally are just doing practices of like pampering rather than actually caring for themselves, and that's, it's part of the process, but it's like, this is just such a minuscule part of like self-care, right? Like, self-care is like actually looking after yourself, right? So what makes you happy? Are you engaging in hobbies and different things and activities that make you happy? Or are you just like living, you're just existing, you know. And this is the thing as well, like people say I don't have time, and it's like you actually get less and less productive if you don't do the stress management stuff, if you don't engage in hobbies that, you know, keep you loving life. You know, you just get less and less productive, because most people, they treat life like a sprint, you know, when in reality it's a marathon, right? So you need to pace yourself. So you need to be able to go, okay, there's times where I want to push hard, but I need to have rejuvenative practices, right? And then finally, you can get professional help. Like if you really are struggling with your stress and all that kind of stuff, like get professional help. Seek out a professional. Obviously, it depends on what you're actually dealing with, but a professional will be able to help you with this stuff, right? And ultimately, look, again, when we're talking about implementing this stuff in your actual life, I know people are just going to skip over the stress management stuff, right? But the first thing you need to do is just take that step back, plan some things out, get everything kind of like in order, where you're like, okay, I have my life in order, and then you can start building on the rest of the stuff, right? I think personally, some sort of journaling is a great idea as the next step. You sit down, you take some time, you plan things out, you have your schedule, you do all the different things, and you go, okay, I need to just somewhat frequently assess how I'm getting on with all these things. I have an idea of all the things I need to do. I've written them all down. I know when I need to do them. And now I'm just making sure that I'm actually sticking to that, and that there's no, you know, thoughts just floating around in my head causing me anxiety, because they're just, I have to constantly think about them, you know? So do you have anything to say on stress management, Gary?
No, I'm a totally chill person. I've got it nailed.
Oh yeah, really?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I agree. I think journaling, or just making note of how your day has been, what's on your to-do list, what you actually have to do, and being objective, I think is really, really valuable, particularly when you're in a period of being quite anxious and stressed and you know you have a lot of things to do. Write them down. They never look as intimidating when they're written down. And when you objectively look at what components there are to each task, it's a lot more achievable, because when they're in your head, everything is worse. Okay. So that's it. We finish up. Fantastic. So, guys, if you're interested in coaching, we do have coaching spaces available. We don't have an age limit on our coaching, at least not an upper one. So if you are someone who is elderly by your own classification, we'd be happy to work with you. You can apply below. You can find information in the description box. Any age, obviously. If you're younger as well, you also fit the bill. We'll take you on. And if you're someone that you think could benefit from this podcast, obviously share it with them. You could also share our coaching information with them if you think that they need this. We also put out a lot of free content. So if you just want to follow along with our free stuff, you can continue listening to the podcast, share it with a friend. You can subscribe to our newsletter, which you can subscribe to below. It goes out every weekend. Valuable free content in there. You can also keep up with the podcast there. We do have show notes for the podcast as well, which we've introduced in the last few weeks. So if you're just listening, make sure you have a look at those as well, particularly when there are additional resources mentioned, because they can be helpful if you want to do further reading. You can also leave a rating and review, which we appreciate, and follow the Triage Method Instagram, where we put out, again, a lot of free content, really valuable stuff, along with on our individual coaches pages. So don't forget to follow those as well.
Fantastic. And I have something else to say. I'm probably going to go for a nice little 15-minute nap now, because other than that, I have to go do my shopping for the day. You know, I have to go get my groceries, because again, that's part of my plan. You know, I sat down and I organized my week, did my stress management practices, planned out what I'm going to eat. You know, I actually got enough sleep last night, and I'm still tired, you know? So look, you can do everything right, and there's still going to be speed bumps, just like I said at the start of this episode. Other than that, guys, I have nothing else to say. I hope everyone enjoys their week, month, year, whatever, and we'll see you in the next one.